This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, I talked to filmmaker Andrew Bujalski, director of such movies as Funny Ha Ha, Mutual Appreciation, and newly on DVD, Beeswax. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Andrew Bujalski is the director behind Funny Ha Ha, Mutual Appreciation, and the newly available on DVD, Beeswax. 3 films that are funny, realistic, aesthetically distinctive, and I would argue fall neatly into no standard established genres. Andrew, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Watching your 3 films, it seems like, I feel like Beeswax is just starkly distinct from the two that precede it. But I can't put my finger on exactly why it is. What would you say to that?
I would probably agree, for starters, but in terms of, are you asking me to put my finger on it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you're the closest person to that film in existence. I can't quite articulate why because it feels different. I can't exactly point to reasons why it's so different, but why do you think it's so different from Funny Ha Ha and Mutual Appreciation?
I could get into a million reasons, which are mostly minutia. One of the things about being so close to a film is, I do sort of see the forest for the trees and the trees for the leaves. So, one thing I could start with technical things. It's we shot widescreen format, which we hadn't on the earlier films, and I could go into the fact that there are twins at the center of it, which I think is very different too from the other films. The first film, all of them have been written for the people who ultimately played the leads. None of whom were professional actors, but all of whom had a particular kind of charisma that I thought would work or translate on screen. Of course, those are very different kinds of charismas. That's another thing that's different about this film, is I think what the Hatcher sisters, Tilly and Maggie, who play the twins in the film, brought to it is there's something about their energy which is a little more inward and not quite like anything I was used to seeing on screen myself, and that I was really interested to try to put at the center of the movie and see what happened. In a way, the audience has to lean forward a little bit further to really see what they're doing. And I think they're, of course, I'm very attached to the film. I think they're miraculous in it. The rhythm of it is a little different. It's I don't know. It's more plot heavy, more exposition heavy. Certainly, that was another challenge going into it. I can go on and on.
This procedure of creating a film, of conceiving a film, starting with the fact that you know somebody and you wanted to see if maybe they could carry a film. It's something you've talked about in other interviews and have done with the previous 2 films as well. Now, what sort of things bring these people to your attention as possible leads, whether they are the Hatcher sisters or whether they're the stars of Funny Ha Ha or Mutual Appreciation?
Maybe it comes from having spent too much time at the movies as a kid. It might not be healthy that you to look around the world and say, how would this translate in the movies? What would this be like if I were asking it to hold together the center of a narrative? I think everybody knows somebody who they think, oh, that guy could be a movie star. And not that I've really kind of asked these people to be quote-unquote movie stars with everything that entails today. In each case, and in no case have I written films that I thought were biographical of these people, per se. Beeswax is not the true story of the Hatchers any more than Funny Ha Ha is the story of Kate Dollenmeyer, Mutual Appreciation of Justin Rice. Those are all films where I kind of took what I thought I saw them, what I could imagine them projecting on screen, how I imagined what they do in their ordinary lives, and translating that into the realm of the performer. I've noticed that all of us tend to kind of, when you ask people to act, and this is probably true for professional actors as well, certainly for non-professional actors, most people seem to pick out something about themselves to exaggerate. People tend to want to do caricatures of themselves. And you start from there, and then you can craft it in one direction or another. But so it was beginning with that, really. What is this kind of essence of you that we can translate into a performance, and then is there a story to be built around that?
Now, was the essence that these actors would pick out from within themselves and exaggerate, was that the same thing you saw in them that you wanted to use to support a narrative? I mean, I can imagine that being either ideal, they pick out the same thing you see in them, or they pick out something completely different and you gotta make a different movie. And how has that happened?
Certainly, yeah. And there are always surprises. There's surprises throughout the production process. And, I mean, anything that you try to boil down in these kind of concrete terms, there are always swerves and surprises. And if somebody ate something weird for breakfast, they might come in a different mood you expected them to be in. Well, certainly with Beeswax, before, I had a vague notion of the story, but I hadn't begun to write it yet. And I went to the girls and asked them if they would. First of all, it's a huge commitment. You're asking somebody who is not a professional actor to take quite a bit of time and quite a bit of emotional energy to give to a project like this. And certainly as we all get older, it becomes harder for people to find the time to do these. So first I asked them if they would even be interested in doing this, and they both seemed game for it. And so we did a little screen test, and at first I had a notion of what these two roles would be, and I asked them, we switched it. We did one run-through of a scene with Maggie playing the small business owner and Tilly playing her sister, and then we did it again and switched the roles. And in fact, my initial instinct had been to cast the opposite of the way I ended up actually doing the film. I thought I would have Maggie Hatcher play Jeannie, the small business owner, and it just became clear from that screen test that what they were going to bring, what they were going to bring of themselves to those roles instinctually, it was much more interesting the opposite way, because Tilly was bringing a lot more kind of a certain reservation and a certain kind of there was an inwardness and even maybe a defensiveness that I thought could be really, really interesting if we used it right in the Jeannie role. And so that was one situation where, certainly it was early on in the process before I'd written the script, but where I saw something that made me think very differently about how I was going to approach this. That's kind of at the macro level. On the micro level, when you're on set, you always have to be paying attention to what the actors are bringing and looking for ways to make the film more interesting.
It seems like you have an interesting relationship to, how to put it, the way your own imagination and what you envision for a film interacts with all of the other minds involved in it. It sounds like for you that's both maybe the biggest challenge, but also something that you absolutely need to do what you do. Does that make any sense?
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, I often, my wife is a novelist, and I often envy her for not having to deal with all the particular pragmatic headaches that come with filmmaking. But I also know that I wouldn't survive doing what she does. She goes off to a room by herself. Everything has to come from within her, and I think that would eventually drive me insane. When it's working, it's great fun, and it's a great feeling to be able to really feed off the energies of others. And directing is a very strange job. If you go to a movie set and you look around, you see lots and lots of people who are, everybody's running around, everybody has specific jobs to do, and on a good movie set, everybody's very talented and very good at their jobs, and the director is the one person who doesn't really do anything. Like, everybody else has some specific task to fulfill, and the director, theoretically is in some cosmic, alchemical way shaping everything, but it's very unclear what the job really is, and ultimately it's just about channeling other people's energies and taking the credit.
Now, is the fact that you're feeding off of these other people's energies, as you've put it, and there's shaping of that going on there, is that Is that why you tend to work with actors, for example, maybe this is true of the crew as well, but actors who you have some sort of existing relationship with, who you're already friends with? Is it easier for you? I mean, obviously the answer should be yes to this, but is it easier for you to work with the energies of people that you have known and got to know in a non-movie making capacity?
Yeah, it's certainly helpful in terms of just knowing what those energies are, just having a better read on the people. That said, there are a lot of people in these films, a lot of people who work on these films, and some of them are old friends. Others are people who I did just meet in the context of making the film. It's probably a limitation of sorts, but I do find that I wouldn't really know how to work with somebody who I didn't essentially like and get along with. I get along with most people, so it's not too narrow a framework. But I do find that I've always worked better communicating in the language of personal rapport as opposed to some elevated language of craft.
To get back to the characters in this in the newly on DVD film, Beeswax, and I was thinking of the contrast between the characters of this film and the characters of the previous two of yours, and it seems to me that what people often bring up as far as the differences between this film and its predecessors, and what's the Chuck Klosterman quote? Yes, the ones before being about people beyond college but unprepared for life. It seems like the characters in Beeswax are, I'm not saying it's a difference in kind, but maybe a little further out of college, a little more prepared for life. Is that an acceptable way to put it?
I'm not sure what constitutes preparation for life. I don't, for better or worse, we're all in it, and it's moving at a constant speed, although sometimes it seems like it's speeding up. Certainly the characters are a little older, which, of course, is a byproduct mostly of the fact that I keep getting older. I think maybe I object a little bit to the notion that any of the characters in the films were unprepared for life. I mean, certainly we all, or that they would ever get more prepared.
Oh, yes.
That it's one or the other. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what they're supposed to be preparing for. There's jobs, there's adult responsibility, so forth and so on, but those come at you one way or another.
Would you say the concept of preparation for life itself is maybe kind of ill-defined, not that useful?
It seems that way to me. Now, of course, someday I'll have a teenage child, and I will throw that same notion at him and say, get prepared for life. But yeah, I think that the world has changed so much. I mean, I had this conversation with, showed the earlier films somewhere. I showed Funny Haha in Florida a few months ago at a college, and there was a hand raised in the audience during the Q&A, and the guy said to me, this all seemed very familiar, but when I was younger, this would be the kind of behavior exhibited in teenagers, and I wouldn't expect it from people in their 20s. Whether or not that's a fair or accurate assessment, I don't know, but I did say that it does certainly seem like there is a kind of ever-extending adolescence in our culture and in whatever particular subset of the culture that I exist in. But I also noted that in terms of marriage and family and all these things, my father was 25 when I was born. My wife is pregnant now. I'm 33. So I just taking that as a rough estimate of how much things maybe have slowed down in a generation. It takes you that many extra years to get to the same place. But does that mean I was less prepared for life? Not necessarily. I just think the world was, and my particular subset of the culture was moving at a different pace.
Now, this is interesting. I want to know what you think of the way that the press about your films, the various reviews and the discussions and the reactions that go on, think about your characters, because obviously you've had such a huge part in these films, and I mean part in the sense of role in making them. You've only acted in 2 of them, but you've had such a role, and you You obviously have a lot of understanding for these characters. I would say compassion for your characters as well. And even the people who like your movies a lot in the press, often they will regard your characters as like one step up from drifters, essentially. How do you feel about that?
Mixed feelings. Again, I think it's kind of for everyone to... I never want to step on anybody's toes who's trying to take their own feeling away from the film, so I never would say, no, you're wrong. By the same token, I will say I've never gone into the films as a sociologist or as an ethnographer. And that's something that sometimes the films are tagged with. This is an ethnographic study of people in their 20s, or of middle-class white people in their 20s. And I can only say that was never my approach or never my intent. I always looked at it, again, stuck in the minutia, at this very basic level of character and story, and I cared a lot about these characters, and I cared a lot about what was happening to them, what paces I was putting them through. So I've always looked at it maybe naively in a much more general sense. Funny Haha for me was really a story about a young girl trying to find her way in the world, much more so than it was a story about the challenges of communication in the 21st century, or whatever the bloggers or the people writing their theses might say about it.
There is a certain amount of grandness, yes, that reviewers use, and I suppose you don't really feel that until you are the subject, or your work is the subject of one of those high-flown reviews.
It's a peculiar position to be in, but by the same, I grew up in that same movie-watching culture and movie-critical culture. I mean, I go to movies and come out of them using words that I learned in college to describe them. So again, I don't want to say that that's the wrong way to approach it, but certainly when you make a film, you fantasize about this kind of platonic ideal of the audience member, who's going to be somebody who really comes in with open eyes and an open heart and ready to experience it on a personal level. That's the thing I most wish for an audience member, is just that they go in there willing and ready to have their own personal experience of the film and have it relate to their own life, and not go into it thinking about something else they read about it or something else they read about some other movie. Of course, that's unavoidable. It's how a lot of us watch movies these days, but it's not my dream.
Now, that openness that you hope for on the part of an audience member, does that hope come from? Is it a hope that springs from not seeing a lot of it around, or is it a hope completely separate from what you actually do see in audience members? That's not a very clear question, but what I mean...
think I get it. No, it's a hope that springs from my best experiences of the movies, that I've kind of had the best time and the most moving experiences when, either by intent or coincidence, I have come to it open. Certainly, some of my favorite movies are movies that I just happened to stumble into, not knowing anything about them, and that's a really hard experience to wrap up and market. And in a way, I feel like Funny Haha had this great journey. I finished that film, quote unquote, finished it in 2002. Of course, one way or another, it's still a presence in my life today. But it took until 2005 for us to have an official theatrical release, because when I finished the film, I was very unconnected in the world of independent film distribution or even the festival circuit. And so it was very slow getting attention for that film and working its way to wider attention. And so in a way, that film had a kind of perfect build where at first people really could come to it free of preconception. And I think that was the best way to see it. And I think I'm happy we got to kind of draw that out on as large a scale as we could. It becomes unrepeatable, and of course, I also wouldn't want to. I don't have the time now to let a film build its audience for 3 years. I'm too busy for that. But it was nice to get to go through it that way, and I do think it was ideal for that film.
Now, with Funny Haha, this is the question that comes to my mind as far as how it got its audience. It seems to me that one of two things could be true, but not both. Number one, it could be it could have found success because it is extremely accessible, because it's like it's a milieu, to use one of those words you learn in college we just mentioned, that people will be super familiar with. It's like pulled from the lives of so many of the audience practically. Or it could be very unaccessible because it doesn't look or feel like a quote unquote regular movie. And I could see either of those being true. Do you think either of those did have an effect on it? Positive in one case, negative slowing in the other?
I think both. And if anything, the harshest critics of certainly of the first two films have always been people who felt like have always been what you would imagine to be the target audience. The most vituperative reviews would be written by somebody who is 23 and just out of college and saying, "Well, that's supposed to be my life, but it's not. Here are the details they got wrong." Real like a very sharp critical eye to it. And I think that's also, I think that a certain kind of, I don't want to get too deep into this. I want to phrase this right, but there is some self-loathing that's endemic to people at that place in their lives and of the American white middle class right now. So, there's not a huge desire to see something too familiar represented on screen.
It's kind of a close-to-home feeling for many, you think?
I think so. Again, maybe that's self-serving of me to say, but certainly it's the impression I've gotten. And
has that decreased over time with your films? I mean, you're now on number 3. I would imagine the characters in Beeswax are distinctive enough that I don't know how many audience members are going to think they're like them in a lot of ways that are obvious. But maybe they do. Maybe I'm predicting wrong, and maybe there's actually more identification this time around.
I really don't know. And what identification there has been is not necessarily always right on. I mean, again, I've always gone into it thinking not about representing a certain social class and not about ethnography, but about very, very specific characters. And my hope is that in doing so, they will seem flesh and blood enough to be relatable and to be familiar. But everybody who walks into that theater has a different experience of life. And the films, to a fault, I've always avoided trying to cue the audience and tell the audience what they should be making of a situation at a given point. And this is the thing that I think people who don't enjoy my films and don't get into them find most infuriating about them, is that they're never being told what the movie's about, and it can drive people crazy. It only works if you are willing to find your way in and figure out what it means to you, or what it feels like to you, maybe more importantly. So the great thing about that, for me, the most exciting thing, is when I do talk to people about the films, when I do go to screenings, I love it when people come out with wildly different opinions. And while the film may decline to tell you this person's a hero, this person's a villain, nonetheless, people do want to make those judgments themselves. So people do come out and say, I love this guy, I hated that guy, and the next person will have felt exactly the opposite. And to me, that's when it feels like it's really working well, when two very different viewpoints can look on the screen, see something that makes sense to them, that feels like a complete world to them, but take away very different conclusions from it.
This notion that the films don't tell the audience what they're about, I think personally as a viewer of film, as a lover of cinema, that's a good thing. I look for that in movies. That's maybe the number one quality my favorite movies share, is they're not, what they are quote unquote about is not obvious and certainly not dictated by the film itself. But there is a side effect to that I was thinking about just last night. My girlfriend was asking me what Mutual Appreciation was about. And so I was saying, well, it's about this guy, musician, who turns up in New York and he kind of complicates the lives of his friends there. And he's at some parties that go on too long, and I could tell I wasn't really selling it.
Right.
But at the same time, it boils down to me saying you just have to watch it. Is that a quality that you find in your own favorite movies, or inspirations is still a bit too grand, but the movies you like?
Yeah, no, I think my favorite movies tend to be ones where a feeling that I love sitting in movie theaters, the feeling of being just one step behind, of watching the movie, being completely engaged, and feeling like I'm just a little behind it. I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to catch up. Obviously, if you fall too far behind, you get frustrated, you give up, or you say, "This is horse shit. They're leaving me behind on purpose." You might have to bleep that. Sorry.
No problem.
But when the world feels complete up there, then you're always willing to go after it, and that's always been my goal, is to get something up on screen that makes a certain kind of sense. If there are moments of obtuseness, if there are moments of confusion, hopefully they ring true and make the thing all the deeper. And that's part of using non-professional actors as well, is that I think part of what, and not to disparage professional actors, obviously 99% of my favorite movies are my favorite movies because of the work done by professional actors in them. But there's a way in which I think part of what a professional actor is trained to do is to clarify and to help the audience understand what the scene is about. And for these films, I didn't want that kind of clarification. And if anything, I think, for better or worse, I don't know that I intended it to be, but I think Beeswax may be the most challenging of my films. And part of that is this real desire and drive on my part to point away from that clarification, that I really enjoy watching characters trying to figure out things that are happening to them. So I always wanted to feel real. I always wanted to have an inherent logic and make sense. But I like feeling a step behind, and I kind of like it when the characters are a step behind, when they're trying to catch up to the movie too.
As a filmmaker working on your own projects, I mean, is it even possible that you could have characters, have actors more very precisely, I should say, articulate what a scene is about? I mean, are you actually writing a scene, conceiving a scene with this concrete idea you can write down and you can express about what it is about?
Yes and no. I mean, I always know, I need to know what I'm doing in some sense as a writer. I need to know where the movie's going, and directing a film is you have to play God. That's the job, and you can't abdicate your responsibility of playing God. But by the same token, you're not God, and there are always going to be things that are beyond your control that you try to use them, you try to work with them to make the film more interesting. But I have found myself as a writer, when I go back to take another pass to write the next draft, sometimes in an early draft, I will come too close to just saying, to have a line of dialogue that says, here's what the scene is about, and that's always the first thing I cut when I go in for the next draft, because it seems to make the scene more interesting to me, to have people trying to discover that thing, or going toward it, or going around it, or going near it, than bouncing off it.
Some of the critics that I really like, when they write about your movies, they will bring up a certain set of themes, a certain kind of usual suite of themes when they're talking about your movies. They'll talk about ethics, they'll talk about morality, they'll talk about just various forms of social confusion and maybe crossed wires or slight miscommunication. It's the ethics and morality component that I find the most interesting there. Do you do you actually see those as being common themes throughout your three films? In some films, Mutual Appreciation, I think especially, you can see the worldviews at cross purposes and the 20 different motivations at once you once talked about in an interview that characters operate with. Is that a constant throughout your films so far?
I think so, and probably more so as they go. I think Beeswax somewhat literalizes that motif in as much as there's this threatened legal battle at the center of it. A lot of the narrative drive of that film comes from one character afraid that she's going to be sued by her business partner. So that's directly about not only a moral ethical standoff, which may now metastasize into this legal battle, but also about the difference between how people conceive of things officially, how you write it down in your legal contract, and how you thought you were relating to that person. What is and any time I've ever signed any kind of contract, it's caused me great anxiety, because I always look at the words on the paper and I think this is not what when we talk on the phone about this, whatever deal this is not the way we're talking about it. This is a whole different language. This is a whole different agreement. And that always has fascinated me, the difference between the official story and then how people actually relate to each other.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. You can find our website at colinmarshallradio.com. Our complete interview archive is there as well. My guest is filmmaker Andrew Bujalski, director of Funny Ha Ha, Mutual Appreciation, and, newly on DVD, Beeswax. If you enjoyed this interview, you may also enjoy the ones I've done with filmmakers Ramin Barani and So-Young Kim. Check those out at our archive once again, colinmarshallradio.com. Now, back to the conversation. This issue of the recontextualization of relationships, it's also been called, you talk about moving something that's been a friendly arrangement into the world of law and contracts and legal language and lawsuits and what have you. And it gets me thinking about how you can see that kind of recontextualization in the previous two movies, in Funny Ha Ha and Mutual Appreciation. And my first impulse is to say that you see it in those, in the sense that characters struggle in those movies to, they have a certain relationships between one another that are tacit, that they don't talk about directly. And then when they do try to transfer those relationships that are expressed in the way they act toward each other to words, when they try to define them in speech, it ends up becoming kind of a dog's breakfast, essentially. It's just this muddle that they can't quite figure out, at least for a while. They're trying to define who they are to each other. Is that too much? Is that too far to extend this, or do you think that's accurate, or what?
I buy it. I don't know that I have much to add.
You buy it, but was it anything you thought, or was it that just kind of how they came out?
I think it's just how it came out, and it's probably, ultimately, a lot of these questions about where do these motifs come from, where do these themes come from, a lot of it probably just comes from my own muddled-mouthedness.
And I do want to get an idea more of how, because you can see the sort of clash of worldviews in your movies, but you can also see, I want to get an idea of what elements of your own worldview are present in there as well. I think you've talked elsewhere about how you can't or have not been able to conceive of characters as being evil or villainous inherently. And that is something and that's another quality. In personally my favorite movies, there aren't bad guys, nor are there necessarily good guys. And is that a quality you find of the movies you like as well, to kind of copy the form of a previous question I asked you? Or is that just the way you find you can write characters, can create characters, or rather that you can't make them this certain sort of, here's the bad one,
Right. It would be interesting to try to do, because obviously I live in the same world that everybody else does, in which there are certainly highly villainous acts undertaken all the time. So where do those come from? Do they come from bad people, or do they come from, somebody was abused as a kid and that's the reason why they're going to now take it out on somebody else? Or where do these things come from? I have trouble. I never meet somebody and think that's a bad guy. I might think, I don't like that guy, or I don't want to deal with that person, or that's not, I don't understand that person. That's a common one. And my wife always makes fun of me for this, is that sometimes we see a movie and occasionally I will say, I didn't like that movie's a piece of crap, but more often I'll say, I didn't get it, which is how I tend to feel about things that I don't relate to. And I guess, maybe evil is something that I just don't relate to. I don't get it. So it's kind of too easy for me to say, well, that's that person is possessed by the devil. It makes more sense for me to say, I don't know where that came from. I don't understand it. I think I was saying this in, I think maybe the interview you're referring to. I always want to be ginger about that, because I know there are people in the world who have been injured by villainous acts, and so I would never say to that person, "Well, you just need to try harder to understand the person who killed your family." I mean, and maybe that is a worthwhile endeavor to try to understand the person that killed your family, but I understand why you might not want to hear that if you're that person. We may be way off topic here.
There is no topic, I think, at this point. But besides, I think it is pertinent. With this issue of bad people or versus the non-bad ones, I think of...
Which, by the way, certainly, as I was saying before, people have come out of my films, and this was a big question when we were doing Beeswax. The Amanda character, the business partner, who may or may not be suing Jeannie, who drives a lot of the story, Ann Dodge, who played that role, I think was very concerned about... She was afraid that her character was the villain in the script, and she didn't want to be the villain, so to some extent, that was something we had to work through on set, is I would find her kind of wanting to soft pedal the character, and I would say, don't do that. Give the character her due, and push it the way the character would, because I don't see her as a villain, and I don't think you should either. She's somebody who has a very, very different perspective than Jeannie, so she's somebody who is frustrating and giving trouble to this nice person who's at the center of the story. But I think, while certainly people can come out of that movie, people have come out of that movie and said, "Oh, I hate Amanda. Amanda's a bitch." I think other people come out of the film, and I think the film certainly makes it very, very possible for you to walk out of there and say, maybe she has a point. she may seem villainous in a certain context, and certainly narrative film asks you to think that whoever's giving the lead character a hard time is the villain. But I think there's a lot of evidence in that film that Amanda might be onto something.
It is interesting with that character Amanda, because I can say for myself that I did, in the first few scenes in which she appears, I did feel something of a dislike for her. I couldn't exactly put my finger on why, because I wasn't totally clear on what the objection was between, or what objection that the character, of course, the shop owner, Jeannie, had to Amanda, and vice versa. And finishing up the movie, Amanda does seem a little more sympathetic, but at the same time, it does seem to me that the actual conflict between them isn't laid out by the film so clearly enough to prevent people from kind of seeing what they want to see in Amanda or even in Jeannie. Is that what you found?
Yeah, that sounds exactly right. And I think it's also true of those conflicts in general. That was also my feeling going into it, is that we certainly discussed, just between myself and the actors, we talked about, because it is not explicit in the film exactly what the crux of their argument is. So we talked about it, and we said, well, here could be some points of contention. Here's maybe how this all grew. But ultimately, I feel like partnerships that end up in disorder like that, it's almost invariably just a situation of personality conflict, of people who don't think about the world the same way, being forced to work together. And although you might think you like each other, when it really comes down to it, when things get difficult, when you have to work together day after day, it's hard not for these personality conflicts to erupt. Like a marriage, either you kind of figure out how to work together, or things really devolve, and that's where this movie finds these characters in this devolved place, trying to figure out how they got there, which is always fascinating to me, because you take people who try to look at things, each of them is looking at the situation rationally, but they have different ideas of what rational is.
This idea of personality conflict in two characters or two sides who are looking in a rational way at the same core issue, but coming to a conflict. It's, I mean, obviously this is at the center of so much drama throughout human history. And I mean drama in the sense of wrought drama versus, as well as drama in just regular life. And it's, of course, a fixture as well of these, of super mainstream movies. Many of them are still about a personality conflict in the broad sense, in the same kind of thing you might use. But in a lot of those very mainstream movies, it is resolved in a kind of textbook way, or there's a standard set of resolutions for these kind of problems that a very mainstream movie might use. And in life, do you find in your films, Beeswax, I don't know if this is too much of a spoiler, but it ends before the resolution of a certain thing, if that's vague enough. And do you find in life these personality conflicts can get resolved, or are these things perpetual? And is that maybe why they interest you?
Well, great question. What do you think? I mean, I think that some people surely can work their way to their own personal version of a resolution. You can cut off ties with somebody and say that person's out of my life, therefore the issue is resolved. But is it? I don't know.
It does become an issue of defining resolution, which is itself sounds like a pretty thorny thing to get into.
Yeah.
Now, I want to get a picture of their films get talked about so often as they're not plot, they're character. You know, there's less plot, there's more character. It's the sort of film that I enjoy, obviously the kind that you do as well, or else you probably wouldn't be making them. But I want to get an idea, since I think you've talked in other interviews about how you started as a kid going to movies all the time, watching Return of the Jedi and watching Friday the 13th Part 5. I believe there's another one you often mention that I think I wrote down, but I'm not sure which one that was. Oh, Rocky 3. Yes, and these are films that are very, very plot-driven. What was your... journey sounds a little bit broad here, but what was your path as just a lover of cinema from plot to character, from liking one to liking the other in larger doses?
I don't know if it's anything so direct as that. I mean, partially, this is also just a journey from being 5 years old to getting older. But I've noticed that and again, this comes down to me, when I come out of a blockbuster and say, I didn't get it, I think it's just how you watch movies. So, those characters were very, like Rocky is a very vibrant character for me, was and is. Maybe all those movies were always character-based in my mind. I don't know.
It's more an issue then of perception. Simply, it's how a viewer sees a movie. A movie might not actually be, this percentage plot, this percentage character. It just kind of depends on what you're looking for.
I think so, yeah. And I think, absolutely, there's no question that my experience has absolutely shown to me that people have different ways of watching movies, which is why some people can't handle my films, because the way that they go to watch a movie does not allow for this kind of storytelling. They can't process it. It's like not being able to digest certain enzymes. I saw Iron Man 2 a few days ago, and I had a great time. I really liked it. But ultimately, I got through. One of the things I liked about it, and I could really get in trouble if I spoil Iron Man 2, but is, the climactic battle with the supervillain was not that long. I was kind of amazed at how relatively concise it was, and it's not something... I don't go to most of the blockbusters, so I'm not completely up to date on them, but it was kind of my impression that, in recent years particularly, like those things are supposed to drag on forever, and you're supposed to... And not that the movie lacks for robots punching each other, it has a ton of that, but that stuff was not the most fun stuff for me, robots punching each other. There are other things that really endeared the film to me, but there are other people who go to the movie and really, really, really want to see robots punching each other and really get something out of that I don't quite understand. I'm not going to take that away from anybody. I couldn't take that away from anybody if I wanted to, but it's just another way of watching movies.
Sure. It seems to me though as well. I haven't seen either of the Iron Man films. I just happen not to have ever walked into one of them. But I have heard that they're blockbuster action movies that set themselves apart from, say, a Transformers or a Transformers 2. I don't know if there's a third one of those, but a Transformers 3. They're set apart from those by having a very nuanced is maybe too much, but a very distinctive character in the person of Iron Man himself at the center of it. Do you think A, that's true, and B, you respond to that?
I think that's a big part of it, but also, I think it also could be what I ate for breakfast when I saw these. I like the second Iron Man better than the first one, which I think is a minority opinion. I just enjoyed the way it moved. Structure also means a lot to me, and so there are all these things that I kind of expect to see in a modern Hollywood movie, and it moved much more reasonably than those. As I said, like let's not spend 45 minutes on the final battle. Not that I felt, underserved by the final battle. The final battle was fine. It was great. But there were a lot of choices in Iron Man 2 that maybe were more character-centric, if I think about it. I don't know. That they were spending time on things, and they were building things in a way that I found was a lot more relatable than what I think blockbusters are in the habit of doing these days. I mean, essentially, I think it's very, very similar to, steroids in Major League Athletics. That kind of every script is on steroids now. It takes a lot of the fun out of me, but to me that does not produce the artistic equivalent of a home run. But obviously, for many viewers, it does.
I am interested by the sort of attitude that you here and elsewhere have displayed toward the dynamic, you might say, between blockbusters and the ones with steroided scripts and all that, as you've said, and everything else, and the movies that aren't driven in that same way. A lot of people who I talk to who are filmmakers, who are young, who are young cinephiles, or who like the kind of movies you make, or like the kind of movies that get clustered in with the sort of movies you make, they'll adopt what I would call a much worse attitude toward this, and they'll say, oh, audiences are stupid, America's stupid, producers are stupid, money is stupid, special effects are stupid.
Money is stupid.
Now,
I'll go with that.
What does that mean to you, the phrase money is stupid? I need some clarification from a filmmaker here.
Over the years, I've developed a fair amount of confidence in my abilities as a filmmaker. So now, I feel like if the word came down, it's time to go make a movie, go out and make a movie. I feel confident that I could bring back something good. Whether or not it's great, that depends whether how lucky we are and how in the zone I am. But I believe I can consistently make good films, and I hope to do that for the rest of my life if I'm able to. I have no confidence in my ability to really produce and participate in the commercial marketplace. The commercial marketplace has always made me very nervous, and probably more so than is necessary. That's kind of something I think I need to get over, and I need to develop some confidence in. But, money has one goal, which is to produce more money. And if you look at the kind of films that come out of that, they're not usually the best films. And something like Iron Man 2, which I enjoyed, I think, is a kind of aberration. It's seems to be sneaking one past the gates. And it's also this cluster of good fortune that Jon Favreau was making that film. He had a certain amount of good taste. He was able to fight these back. You read interviews with him, and he talks about how he had to fight to cast Robert Downey in the first one. He had to fight to cast Mickey Rourke in the second one. And you look at these films, and you go, well, of course, these guys make the movie, and that's somebody who was in a position of power, who had the juice to kind of push against the money in one sense, although obviously it worked out fine, and the money is happy.
Now, it seems to me, though, that a director controls many things, but the one thing a director can't really control, in the way I'm imagining it, is the return the financial return a movie is going to get, because there's just so many players, as you well know, as you know better than me, between the director and the people paying at the other end, the audience members, the people buying the DVDs. There's all this distribution stuff and all these rights issues and where it plays and who's screening it and all that. In a real sense, can you care as a director about the money that it makes? Of course you do care, because the money it makes affects you, but does it make sense to care in terms of the actual influence a director wields over the final return?
I wish I didn't. And it's something that I've made 3 fairly cheap, fairly small films where there was no expectation for them to be blockbusters by any means. But I've always gone into it really, for better and worse, refusing to think about money until the movie's done. When the movie is done and we're ready to go out and try to bring it into the world, then we can talk about how to market it. I'm not interested in talking about how to market it before we make it. And maybe that's naive, maybe that's childish, maybe that needs to change, but I've always felt like the one thing that the vast majority of movies that are released in the commercial marketplace have in common is that they were in some way designed with that marketplace in mind. Obviously, the studios have kind of made a science out of it, and it's hit or miss in the indie world, but most movies that are made, somebody somewhere has an idea of how they think they're going to get their money back, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. I always thought, well, if I take that out of the equation, I open up a whole other spectrum of things I can do as a filmmaker. There's all kinds of movies that just can't get made from that mindset. So if I kind of remove sustainability from the list of priorities, then there's a lot more I can do and a lot more that I'm interested in. I mean, that's another thing that, for better or worse, I'm stuck with, is that a lot of the things I'm interested in go hand in hand, in my mind, with ways to lose money.
Now, it seems like we've reached a point where the sort of aesthetic that you have worked in and the aesthetic that a lot of, at least a handful of other pretty well-known filmmakers of your generation and younger have worked in, that's become a recognized way of making films that are good and that people appreciate and that are attractive in some sense to audiences. But that seems to me that it also brings about the conditions where, I don't know, I hesitate to use the word suit, but some suit might say, hey, now that these sort of movies about 20-somethings made kind of lo-fi or hot, here's what we do. We market this movie as just to these 20-somethings, and we're going to say it's going to be really deliberate in terms of it's going to be made to look deliberately 16-millimeter-y, deliberately, quote-unquote, directionless protagonists, all this like super engineered version of, say, a funny ha-ha. Is that actually, first of all, a condition that has obtained? Is the money world actually interested in making sort of the cynical funny ha-has at this point?
I don't think so, and I think basically what it comes down to is, these days anybody can log on to boxofficemojo.com and see what these movies gross, and they don't gross that high. There are a lot of reasons for that, and the world has. Certainly the world for independent film in general, depending on your definition of crisis and if this merits it as one, there is a kind of crisis of independent film right now where it's very, very hard to make money back on anything that's quote-unquote independent. Even the things that you would think would have been indie hits 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, are having a lot more trouble today for a lot of reasons. So that's a lot of excuses. What I'm trying to say is my movies have not made a lot of money. And so any suit looks at that first before they think about what they might be able to pillage from it. So I think, certainly a business-savvy person might look at my films and say, there's something we can use here, but they're not going to try to replicate those films.
The name of the newly out on DVD film is Beeswax. The other two are Mutual Appreciation and Funny Ha Ha. Andrew Bujalski, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Thanks for having me.
This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. You can find our website at colinmarshallradio.com, where our complete interview archive is as well. You can hear this one again, or any other in the Marketplace of Ideas interviewing history. The website of the man who produces our theme music, Ben Althouse, is available at benalthouse.com. Questions, comments, feedback, positive, negative, neutral, otherwise, send it along to me, Colin Marshall, at colin@colinmarshallradio.com. That is COLIN at colinmarshallradio.com. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.